The great black stallion screamed and went up on its hind legs, and the groom holding the lead rope was lifted clean off his feet and flung into the paddock dust, and the Duke of Ormecliff, watching from the rail with his jaw set hard, thought for the third time that month that he would have to have the animal shot. "Leave him," Benedict said sharply as two more grooms ran in. The fallen man scrambled clear under the fence, white-faced and clutching his wrist. The stallion wheeled in the center of the paddock, sweat dark and trembling, nostrils flared red, 16 hands of ungovernable fury, and not a man on the estate would go near him now. Leave him be. Sutton was a magnificent ruin of a horse. The Duke had bought him for a king's ransom on the strength of his blood and his look, and the look had not lied. There was not a finer animal in the north of England, but no one had told Benedict, until the money was paid, that 3 men had been hospitalized in the creature's previous yard, and the last had not walked again. Sutton suffered no bit, no saddle, no hand on his neck. He had thrown every groom in the Ormecliff stables and bitten 2 and broken the arm of the headman, who was the best horseman the Duke had ever employed and who had told him, plainly the morning he resigned that office, the horse was mad and could not be saved. So the Duke stood at the rail in the golden light of a late afternoon and watched the animal pace and blow, and thought of the pistol in the gun room, and hated the thought, because to shoot Sutton would be to admit defeat, and Benedict Ormecliff did not care to admit defeat to anyone, least of all to a horse. He had ridden hard all his life. It was the one thing in the world that had ever quieted the restless, exacting temper in him, a fast horse and a long country, and the wind taking the noise of his own head away. His father had been a cold, demanding man who had found his son always wanting, and Benedict had grown into a cold, demanding man himself, who found most things wanting in their turn, but on horseback, alone the demand went out of him, and he was for an hour or two simply a man and an animal moving together over the green earth, asking nothing of each other but trust. He had bought Sutton because the horse had looked, in the dealer's yard, like the finest of that freedom he had ever seen offered for sale. He had not known he was buying a creature whose freedom had been beaten half to madness before it ever reached him, and the knowledge sat in him like a reproach, as though he had paid good money for a wrong he could not now undo. "Your Grace." He did not turn. The voice belonged to one of the dairy women, or a laundry maid. He could not have said which. The estate had a great many of them, and he was in no humour to discuss butter. "Your Grace, if you mean to shoot him," the voice went on quiet and even, "let me try him first." That made him turn. She was a slight young woman in a plain brown gown, perhaps 24, with her hair pinned back simply and a few strands loose at her temple, and she was looking not at him but at the horse, with an expression he could not at once read, not fear, which was what he expected, something more like sorrow. Her hands were folded at her waist. She did not look like a person who could lift a saddle, let alone master a killer. "And who," said the Duke, "are you?" "Hester Quill, Your Grace. I help in the dairy." Her eyes never left the stallion. "I was raised on my father's farm. Before it failed he bred horses, difficult ones, the ones no one else would take. He sold them gentled when he could gentle them." She paused. "Your horse is not mad, Your Grace. He is frightened. There is a difference, and the difference is everything." Benedict looked at her, and then at Sutton, who had stopped pacing and stood now blowing in the corner of the paddock with his head low and his sides heaving, and looked, for the first time, less like a demon than like an animal at the end of its endurance. "He has put 4 men on the ground," the Duke said, "one of them my head groom, who has handled horses for 30 years. I will not have a dairymaid's death on my conscience to spare a horse's life." "Then forbid me, and shoot him," she said simply, "and you will never know." She turned her gentle face up to him at last, and there was nothing impertinent in it, only a quiet certainty that he found, against every instinct that he believed. "But if you let me try, Your Grace, I ask only this, that no one comes into the paddock, that no one raises his voice, and that you give me as long as it takes. Hours, perhaps. He has been hurried and beaten his whole life. He will not be saved in a hurry. The Duke of Ormecliff was a hard, exacting man, and he had not built the finest stable in 3 counties by indulging the fancies of dairymaids. But he was also, beneath the hardness, a man who could not bear waste, the waste of a great animal, the waste of a thing that might be saved, and there was something in the steady brown gaze of Hester Quill that he could not bring himself to overrule. "The grooms stay out," he said at last to the men at the rail, "all of you. And you," to her, "if he turns on you, you go over the fence. And there is no shame in it, and I will hear no argument. Is that understood?" "Yes, your grace," and she was already unlatching the gate. What followed, the Duke would remember for the rest of his life. She did not approach the horse. That was the first surprise. She walked to the centre of the paddock, well clear of him, and she sat down in the dust, sat, as calm as a woman at her own hearth, and she folded her hands and she waited. Sutton flung up his head and snorted and pawed and watched her with a rolling, suspicious eye, plainly braced for the rope and the shout and the whip that had always come before. None came. The young woman sat in the gold light and did nothing at all, except, after a while, to begin to hum a low, tuneless, drowsy sound, barely audible at the rail, the kind of sound a person makes to a fretful infant in the dark. Minutes passed. The Duke did not move. The sun slid lower and turned the paddock dust to amber. The stallion took a step toward her. Then he froze as if astonished at himself, and flung his head again and retreated. She did not look at him. She went on humming. He came another step, and another, his ears flicking forward and back, in an agony of indecision, and the Duke, gripping the rail, understood that he was watching something he had no name for, that this slight woman was doing nothing, and that the nothing was the whole art of it, that she was offering the animal the one thing no one had ever offered him, which was the freedom to choose. It took the better part of an hour. The light had gone deep gold, and the swallows were out over the paddock before Sutton, blowing and trembling, dropped his great black head and brought his muzzle down to the crown of Hester Quill's bowed head and breathed her in. And still she did not grab at him. She lifted one hand, slowly, and laid it flat against his jaw, and the stallion, who had broken a man's arm a week before, stood with his eyes half closed and let a dairymaid stroke the long muscle of his neck, and shuddered all over once, like a creature waking from a nightmare into a kinder room. Benedict realized he had stopped breathing. The grooms at the rail were silent too, those same hard men who had been thrown and bitten and broken, who had sworn the horse was a devil and good for nothing but the knacker. Benedict heard one of them, the youngest, breathe out a soft astonished oath, and another hush him. They had seen, all of them, what no skill of theirs had been able to do, done by a dairymaid sitting in the dust, and there was a kind of shame in it and a kind of wonder, and the Duke felt both himself and did not look away from her for a moment. She rose then, by inches, and the horse let her rise, and she stood at his head with the loose mane blowing across her brown sleeve and her plain gown grey with dust, and she looked across the paddock to the Duke at the rail, and she did not smile in triumph. She only said, in that same even voice, carrying clear in the still evening air, "He wants to be good, your grace. No one has ever let him." For a long moment the Duke of Ormecliff could not speak. He had seen great horsemen at their work. He had seen his own broken head groom, the finest in the north, and counted himself fortunate in the man. He had never in his life seen anything like this. And it was not only the skill of it that had silenced him. It was the thing the skill had come out of, the sorrow he had seen in her face at the rail, the patience that could only have grown in a person who knew herself, what it was to be hurried and overlooked, and never once asked what she wanted. She told him a little of it that first evening, as the swallows wheeled and the light went from gold to rose over the fells. Her father had bred horses on a small farm in the Dales, and had a gift, and had passed the gift to his daughter, who from the time she could walk had been the one the difficult animals trusted. They had been poor but not unhappy, the two of them, in a world of horses, and then a hard winter and a harder landlord had taken the farm, and her father had taken a fever and died of it, and Hester, at 20, had found herself alone in the world with no fortune and no protector and a gift that no one would pay a woman to use. So she had gone into service, because a woman alone must eat, and had churned butter at Ormecliff for 3 years with her hands aching for the work they were made for, and watched, from the dairy window, the grooms in the paddock fail with a horse she could have mended in an afternoon, and said nothing, because who would have listened to a dairymaid? She had only spoken at last because she could not stand by and let a frightened animal be shot for the crime of having been broken by cruel men. My father used to say, she finished quietly, that there is no such thing as a bad horse, only a horse that has been failed by people. I have come to think it is true of a good deal more than horses, your grace. She did not look at him as she said it. But the Duke of Ormecliff, who had been failed by a cold father and had grown hard in the failing, heard it, and felt it land somewhere under his ribs, and said nothing, because he did not trust his voice. Miss Quill, he said, when he had mastered it, and his voice was not quite steady, you will not go back to the dairy. She blinked. You will have charge of my stables, the Duke said. All of them. The headman has gone. The place is yours. I will not have a gift like that wasted on churning butter, and I will not. He stopped, and started again, more plainly than was his habit. I find I do not wish to do without the sight of it. The colour came up in her dust-streaked face. Your Grace, a woman cannot. This Duke says she can, said Benedict, and on this estate that is the whole of the law, and he came through the gate himself, slowly, careful as she had taught him without a word to be careful, and Sutton flicked an ear at him and did not shy, and the Duke of Ormecliff, for the first time within arm's reach of the horse he had meant to shoot, and put his own hand, under her quiet eye, against the great warm neck. She did not go back to the dairy. The first weeks were not easy. The grooms enthroned by Sutton did not at once take kindly to being set under a dairymaid, and there were dark looks and muttered words in the yard, and one of them, the headman's own nephew, who had thought the place would be his, was openly insolent till the morning Hester, without raising her voice, set him a horse he had sworn was unbreakable and bid him watch how it was done, and an hour later handed him the lead rope of an animal gentle as a lamb, and said only that he might pit that way if he learned to ask the creature instead of fighting it. The man went red, and then thoughtful, and within a month was her most devoted pupil. For that was the other gift of her, the Duke came to see. She did not lord her art over anyone. She taught it freely, to any groom willing to put down his whip and learn patience, and she gentled the men of the yard much as she gentled the horses, by waiting, and by never once making them afraid. The Duke watched it all. He told himself, those first weeks, that he watched to be sure his strange appointment did not bring the stables to ruin, but the truth, which he was a long time owning, was that he had taken to walking down to the paddock in the gold of every evening for no better reason than that it was the 1 hour of his day he looked forward to. He would lean on the rail and watch the slight brown figure in the dust with her difficult, frightened, half-ruined horses, and feel the old restless demand go quiet in him as it had only ever gone quiet on horseback, and find, when at last the light failed and she turned to go in, that he was sorry the hour was over. She had charge of the Ormecliff stables, and within a year they were spoken of in every county, for there was not a ruined or vicious or hopeless horse in the north that gentleman did not send to the strange young woman at Ormecliff who could mend what no one else could touch. The Duke watched her work in the gold paddock evenings as another man might have gone to the theatre. It was the finest thing he knew, and somewhere in that year of watching, the awe in him deepened by slow degrees into something he was a long while admitting, because Benedict Ormecliff was as slow to be gentled as his own black stallion, and Hester, who understood such creatures, did not hurry him. There were those who tried to make trouble of it. A neighbouring squire's wife, calling at Ormecliff, remarked with a thin smile that it was very singular indeed, for a duke to keep a dairymaid in his stables and to be seen leaning on the paddock rail at all hours watching her. People would talk, she said. People were talking already. Benedict had looked at the woman with the cold dukely stare that had silenced bolder than she, and said that people who had nothing better to do than count the hours a man spent admiring excellence might be assured he intended to go on giving them a great deal to count, and that he would thank her to convey his compliments to her husband and the contents of this conversation to no one. The squire's wife had gone away affronted, and the talk had died, because there was not a soul in the county who dared face that stare twice, but had clarified something in the Duke, that conversation. He had defended Hester Quill before he had let himself understand why he so badly needed to. The understanding came on a wild March night, when a mare in his stables went down in a hard falling, and the grooms came hammering at the house for Miss Quill, unable to sleep, went down to the stables himself and found her there in the lantern light, her sleeves pushed back and her arms to the elbow in the business of bringing a life into the world, calm in the midst of the blood and the straw and the mare's distress as she was calm in all things. He stayed, he held the lantern. He did as she bid him, this Duke who bid everyone, and at the grey of dawn a wet new foal stood swaying on its impossible legs and the mare lipped at it. Hester sat back in the straw, exhausted and streaked with the night's work, and laughed for pure gladness, and Benedict Ormecliff, kneeling in the straw of his own stable with the lantern in his hand, looked at her tired joyful face and knew, with a completeness that frightened him, that there was no longer any part of his life he wished to live without her in it. She did with him what she had done with Sutton. She did not grab. She waited, and was patient, and let the hard man come to her in his own time, and one gold evening at the paddock rail, with the swallows out, and the great horse grazing easy behind them, the Duke of Ormecliff turned to the dairymaid he had made the mistress of his stables, and found he had no more words in him to fight it with. "You said he wanted to be good," Benedict said roughly, and no one had ever let him. He looked at her, and his hard face was open in the gold light in a way no groom at Ormecliff had ever seen it. "I am a worse-tempered animal than that horse Hester Quill, and a great deal less deserving, and I have stood at this rail a year now wanting to be a better man, and not knowing how a man begins. Will you teach me as you taught him? Will you have me?" And Hester, who had stepped forward once into a paddock that every man feared, stepped forward now and laid her flat hand against the Duke's jaw, as she had laid it against the horse's, and felt the great proud creature of him shudder once and go still, and turn his face into her palm. "You were never the difficult one," she said softly. "You only thought you were. The difficult ones are the ones nobody waits for. Someone waited for you, your grace. I have been waiting since the day you came through that gate." And she rose on her toes, dust still on her plain gown and the loose mane smell of him in her hair, and the Duke of Ormecliff, who had been ready to shoot what he could not master, bent his proud head at last to the quiet young woman who had mastered him without once raising her voice, and was, ever after, gentled and glad of it, and hers.